Buddy. What I'm going to do is give you a talk that I know a few of you've seen in some form. You've probably seen it in exactly this form. Um, but the title of the talk is Publishing Without Perishing. And this is a talk that I've given hundreds of times. I literally lost track over time. And what it's really aimed at doing is to kind of give you perspective on the nature of publishing. And I'm really talking more as an editor, as somebody who has edited lots of things, rather than somebody who is sort of saying, well, here's what's made me successful in my career. And in that sense, it's something where I think it's important to sort of kind of understand the nature of the academic game, but also to understand the nature of what it is that many editors look at. And I can give you a perspective of a number of others, as editors. And in some sense, this is kind of a little bit of my background, kind of saying, well, why should you listen to somebody like me talk about stuff like this? I've had different editorial roles. I've been an editor of a number of publications. I founded a number of journals, been an associate editor. I'm on, I don't know, something like 12, 14, 15 editorial review boards. I think that list isn't really correct, I think. I've reviewed for, God only knows how many journals. I serve as a director of SSRN. I've worked on things like the REF, the equivalent of the REF. I do a lot of external grant reviewing. I sit on the SAMS trustee board. I'm part of the Committee on Publication Ethics. I think I sit on every subcommittee known to mankind for COPE. I've organized God only knows how many conferences, probably at least a dozen, if not 24 different conferences, and been on the executives of a number of academic associations. So I've sort of kind of had, I've had a bit of longevity, which means I've done a lot of stuff, and through all of that, I would have seen, tens of thousands of papers come through. In any given year, I probably write anywhere between 10 to 15 promotion and tenure letters, mostly for U.S. schools, although a few for other schools. And so I have kind of a feel for the nature of the field. And so in that sense, I could probably give you, at least some advice you might want to kind of follow on. But there is a reality associated with the academic world. And it comes in two cartoons. The first one is, shows a number of hitmen coming to a professor's office, and sort of, putting the silencer on the gun and saying, well, surely, professor, you knew that this was publish or perish, and you hadn't published. And my favorite is this one, which is too bad about old Ainsworth. He published, but he perished all the same. My view on this is that you're in academics to engage in a process which includes publication. If you're not going to be an academic, if you're not really kind of interested in that, then there might be other things that you might do. But fundamentally, if you want to sort of kind of climb the greasy pole, then climbing the greasy pole implies that you actually have to publish. And not only do you have to publish, you have to publish consistently over some period of time. Historically, this is not meant that you publish over your entire lifetime, but certainly during the periods of time in which you're trying to climb that greasy pole up to professorship, you certainly have to have kind of a record which is commensurate with whatever institution it is that you end up going to. And this varies dramatically from institution to institution and from country to country. And so a professorship isn't a professorship. It's not really there isn't an equivalence to the title from one country to the next. And from the standpoint of PhD students, when you get the degree, you sort of kind of feel that you've got some finality to the things that you've been putting forward. But again, there's another kind of brutal reality, and that is that everybody with whom you're competing has also crossed that same finishing line. So the differentiator in terms of kind of your future career isn't really going to be whether you were successful as getting your PhD or even what mark you received in getting your PhD. So places like the UK, they tend to give you, they give you marks, so people say, oh, I got my PhD with a high class honors. The US doesn't do that. I mean, as Gene Fama once told me, I was playing tennis with him, the best dissertation is a completed dissertation. Nobody cares beyond that point. What matters is ultimately the publications which follow. And the other aspect of this, which is important to keep in mind, is that there is a kind of a food chain here. And this comes back to the issue of the kind of the consistency of the way in which you publish. Probably 35 years ago, certainly 40 years ago and further back, most academics published a lot early in their career. And then as they kind of hit 50, 40, 50, whatever, their publications started to decline. And part of the reason for that was the people moved into administrative roles. There wasn't what we see today, where you have kind of an administrative industrial complex within the universities, and there's kind of a professional class of managers, many of whom have PhDs, but they're not really publishing scholars. They're really administrative individuals who just simply happen to have a PhD. What you tend to see in that world, in the prior world, was that as people advanced in the system, they picked up administrative roles, and so the model of faculty governance had an implication for the career progression. Today, the expectation is that you publish until you drop dead, and that's kind of the game. If you actually look at the statistics, they show this. But the other aspect of this, and this is just some old data. And I took this from Australia, and this is just the citation data from business schools in Australia. And this is the number of scholars with lifetime citations of a certain level. And again, this was a few years back, so I haven't updated it. But the main point of this is you see a heavily skewed distribution. And then the reality is that the median number of citations for an academic globally, certainly in the United States, because that's where the statistics for this came from, is zero. Most people write things that nobody ever uses or reads. And this isn't only for academics. So there was a study by the World Bank that asked the question, how many people downloaded the World Bank reports? And it turned out that the median number of downloads was zero. In other words, the World Bank was cranking out all of these economic studies, all these social studies. And the reality was that all the stuff they were putting on their websites and these reports, nobody was ever reading. And I think this is kind of the nature of the reality, which creates a bifurcation between kind of one academic reality and another academic reality. And you might sort of say, okay, well, if I'm at the University of Manchester, don't you expect all faculty to publish and all faculty to have kind of at least some reasonable number of citations? And the answer to that question is yes. But the thing I think you have to also realize is that there are 13,000 business schools in the world. In fact, probably more today. Okay, and God only knows how many academics there are. So if you think about 13,000 business schools, with probably certainly more than 1 million business school academics worldwide, not everybody's publishing. And the reality is that it isn't even an 80-20 rule. It's probably more of a 99 0.99 and then a 0.01 rule. Because if you look at the citation patterns, once you've got citations, let's say 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, you're already in the 99.9 something percentile. So if you look in this Australian case here, the citations from 1990, you more or less only have one individual who has above 10,000 at that time. And if you looked at that and sort of said, okay, well, is this probably normal? Is the distribution you see here normal? The answer is yeah. Today it might be that number is that there's one person with more than 20,000, but the main point is distribution is the same. And I think this is really where part of the big difference comes in, and that is that there's a bifurcation in the publication process, there's a bifurcation in the career process. There was a study done by an economist in Austria many years ago, probably at least 10 years ago, and he looked at the pay and performance of academics, and he compared them to football players, soccer players. And what he found the distribution was fairly similar. That there's kind of a whole bunch of kind of what he call yeoman type of players, and then there are a couple stars, and then there are a couple superstars. And he compared that to the distribution of academics, and he basically found the same thing. So there are these kind of selection mechanisms and other things, and so it becomes an issue that says, okay, well, there's some kind of common denominators here, and I think part of the common denominator is that you sort of kind of have some smart people, then you have some uber smart people. And I think that the question then becomes, all right, well, how do you compete in a game when you've got kind of so much of the airspace being kind of taken up by super smart and uber smart people? Because if you look at the distribution of citations, this tends to kind of suck up a very large amount of this. I'll stop periodically. We'll have some questions, and then you can sort of see this. The other aspect of this, and I know this is this is the depressing part of the talk, by the way, is that this is not really an easy game. And one of the things I try to highlight to people when I talk about this is to say, if this was really an easy game, everybody would do it. Okay, it would be something which was second nature to nearly everybody. But it isn't actually. There are aspects of kind of writing scholarly work which is not any different from that cartoon about novelists. There's an aspect of this which is not very perfunctory. Yeah, there are some novelists out there who crank out a novel every 6 months. They write kind of the airport romance books, and they just crank them out one after another. They make millions of dollars, if tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, writing what effectively is not very, very good literature, but it's kind of mind candy for people at airports and on planes and elsewhere, right? These people are not going to win any kudos over time. They're just kind of run of the day novelists. But then you kind of have kind of a true group of people who sort of kind of stand out. And this is kind of what defines aspects of the game, once you get into sort of kind of the leading universities. The other aspect of this, which again is part of the depressing part of this, is that we've been increasingly metricized. When I first started as an academic, back before the internet existed, nobody paid attention to any of this stuff. What you did is you did your work, you went to conferences, you talked to people. When you came up for promotion, your school wrote out for recommendations about the quality of the work that you were doing. They got recommendations back, they made a decision, and you were either promoted or you weren't promoted. Um, Nobody talked about your citations. Nobody talked about your grant success. Nobody talked about these things. This wasn't really how promotion occurred, even into the 1990s. But with the kind of ultrametrics kind of model, the sabermetrics model, the same thing you see in sports, where what we do is we not only track how many goals somebody has, or how many assists somebody has, we track how much running they do in a game. We track the number of passes they make. We track the number of sorts of passes that they make. And we get exactly the same thing in academics. Exactly the same thing in academics. And therefore you have this increasing pressure on sort of kind of pushing the numbers. And I think that in the long run, this has ultimately had a negative effect, because what it means is that the people who ultimately pay the bills, which might be governments or might be students, or might be others, they believe the ultrametrics, they believe the numbers. They look at the rankings, and the rankings are simply made up of numbers. Now part of it is garbage in, garbage out. But the reality is that people pay attention to these sorts of numbers. And increasingly you have kind of a game that goes on. Everybody is chasing an MVP award. Everybody is chasing kind of the next plaque on the wall. And the reason is because their institutions react to those things. So what ends up happening is the numbers become the game, rather than the ideas becoming the game. Okay, so that's kind of the negative aspects of this. But the reality is that you're just simply stuck in this. This is the reality in which you are stuck. It's not like you could sort of sit there and bemoan it. It's not going to go away. It is just simply the reality of the nature of publishing. But there are certain basics of publishing which I think are really quite important. And the reason these will sound almost trite to some people, but you would be surprised at how badly people do this. And I like to make this point about reviewers and others, and that is, reviewers are people with guns. And what you don't want to do with people with guns is give people with guns bullets. And when you make unforced errors, when you make own goals, you actually give them bullets. You give them reasons to reject your paper, or your grant, or whatever it is that you're writing. And what you want to do is you want to try to minimize the number of bullets that you give to them. If there's something wrong with the science and what you're doing, your data isn't perfect, or your analysis has got its own limitations, that in many ways is okay. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have flaws which are induced by yourself. That you inappropriately use a method, that you don't write it in the right sorts of ways. So let's come back to the basics of this. To me, there are certain basic things in terms of writing, and this is really, really bread and butter stuff. The first one is to whom you're writing. And this, I think, is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And that is, they actually write their papers never to be read. What they do is they write their papers because they want to write their papers. And they may be concerned about the reviewers, but they actually aren't concerned that much about the readers. And so if you go and you ask people point blank, who's the audience for your paper? Most people can't answer it. Okay, and academics are terrible at this, right? So if you go in and you ask the average person, you say, okay, who's the target audience for your paper? And they'll say, oh, well, yeah, it's other academics like me. Students might be interested in it. Oh, business people might be interested in it. Government policy people might be interested in it. And if there's alien life on Mars or at Alpha Centauri, I think they would be interested in my research too. Okay, and the answer is that's mind-numbing. Okay, and it's mind-numbing because if you don't know to whom you're writing, you don't know the things you need to emphasize. Okay, and I'll show you in a minute that it comes back on to a whole host of other types of things that you're doing. So this idea that what you do is you write to an academic audience and you write to a business audience is just simply incorrect. It doesn't work that way. You either write to an academic audience or you write to a business audience. Now, some business people can read academically oriented work, and many academics can read business oriented work, right? It's a lot easier for academics to read business publications than it is for business people to read academic publications. But the point of this being, you can't write to both. If you try to write to both audiences, you will suboptimize to both audiences. Okay, so the main point being, you have to understand to whom you're writing. Okay, if you do have multiple audiences, you really have to be very clear as to the priorities. And this leads on to this kind of the second thing, and that is, well, what do I have to say? What do I want to say to those that are in that to whom? And in other words, if I don't know to whom I'm writing, how is it I can actually say something relevant to somebody I don't know who they are? Right? And so from an academic standpoint, when people talk about, well, read the academic literature, find the gaps in literature and all this sort of stuff, they're assuming that you're writing to an academic audience. Right? Academic audiences require different levels of structure. They require different types of background research. And in that sense, they tend to kind of downplay other types of things. If you read, and in fact, I recently read a government report on a kind of really interesting topic. I won't name it because it's a bit sensitive. And the interesting thing was that there was zero references to academic research. None, no reference to academic research whatsoever. And the question was, well, how could you have kind of a high-level policy document for which there's no, there's no reference to academic research? Was there no academic research there? And the answer to that question is no, there were tons of academic research there. But it's totally irrelevant to parliamentarians, right? The parliamentarians they don't care about what's important to academics. And therefore they relied on reports from think tanks, consultancies, journalists, and others. Okay, and in fact, their priorities are very different from the academic priorities. And then this is the kind of the why, and that is why is it what I'm saying is relevant to these people, right? As soon as you kind of go into a journal where you start talking about contributions to theory, you're completely going to turn off a policy or a business audience. And in some sense, you could talk, for example, be talking even across academic realms. You can be talking, for example, to political scientists, and then have business people read the same articles, and they would simply not find it as relevant to them. Okay, so you get this question of sort of saying, okay, well, what's interesting to these people, to whom? Okay, what do they find intriguing? Okay, what might they find insightful? Right, and this is a big problem, because the most things aren't intriguing, and most things aren't interesting, and most things aren't insightful. Again, think about the number of academics. If there's 1 million academics out there writing 1 million articles, do you think all those 1 million articles per year that they're writing are all interesting and insightful and intriguing? And the answer to that question is no. So this kind of tells you something about what's going on, and it's not that it's intriguing or exciting to you. Okay, so normally when you talk to academics, particularly PhD students, they're very passionate about what it is that they're doing. Okay, which is fine. There's no problem with that. The difficulty comes when they actually discover it isn't as intriguing or exciting to others, and therefore you have this problem that you really have to work long and hard to be able to justify what it is that you're doing. And then there's the last part of this, which is the evidence in some sense. And that is the how am I going to convince people that what I'm saying is important? Okay, not only that it's right, but that I've got the evidence to sort of kind of add to a conversation here. Okay, and what you're really kind of getting at here are two things. One thing is what I call the competence of the language. Okay, so if I do a paper and the paper is looking at panel data over a 20-year period, and I'm using Bayesian econometric methods to analyze that at the individual firm level. Am I doing that competently? And you might sort of say, well, what does that have to do with language? The answer is that's the communication vehicle. The communication vehicle of the evidence is the statistical modeling. Okay. And the question that people would ask is, well, did he do the statistics right? Did he do the data analysis right? Did he collect the right data? Did he formulate the data in the right way? If I'm doing some ethnographic study, let's say I'm doing a video ethnography, then there's another set of languages. There's another set of ways of thinking about things, structuring what it is I'm doing, looking at how it is I'm going to look at it. And again, the reviewers are kind of in part of this process. They're going to look at this and say, well, is this done in the appropriate way? Have they made mistakes? Have they done it well? And so there's that. And this is also relates back to the question of, is the language of the audience? Okay, so again, if I'm doing a big qualitative study, econometricians aren't going to be my reviewers. Econometricians may not be my audience. Okay, so I may be using the wrong language for these people, and the reverse is also true. Okay, and that is that qualitative researchers, quantitative researchers speak different languages. Okay, you can get into a long argument about which language is a better language for certain problems, but the main point of this being that this is a huge issue. Okay, I'm not talking about rigor. I'm not talking about relevance. I'm talking about any of that stuff. What I'm saying if you are talking to them in a way that is inappropriate for the way they understand things, you'll never get across to them. Okay, business people tend to like examples. Business people tend to like case studies, right? They like to have stories, right? And so do lay people. So do public audiences. Okay, which is why when you go into the airport bookstore, you don't find books on the airport bookstore which are talking about econometrics. Okay, they talk about stories. They're not the same types of things. In other words, Malcolm Gladwell is not a scientist. He's just simply a translator. He takes things which in some ways he doesn't understand, and he translates them for a lay audience. Okay, in other words, he changes the language. Right? And this is the difference between kind of the popular, BBC historian and a real historian. This is the difference between the person who does, kind of the Sunday evening, oh, here's kind of popular science, or here's popular history, here's popular ecology, and brings it to the masses. Okay, because they're talking to a different audience. So I always insist on people at the very beginning saying very clearly who are the to whom. Okay, who you're referencing, who you're talking to, who do you want to be part of a conversation? What do you have to say to them? Why is it important to them? And how are you going to convince them that you've got solid evidential backing to what it is that you're talking about? That evidence could be logic, or that evidence could be data. But the main point I would come back to is, you notice there's no I in any of this. I didn't say anything about what you want to do, but everything is externally oriented. Who's the reader? Why is it important to them? What is it that they're interested in? And how do you convince them? Okay, has nothing to do with what you want. Okay, it has to do with what the audience wants. Okay, because otherwise what you're doing is you're writing for yourself. Okay, and I jokingly sort of kind of ask people at some time, and I say, well, when they say, oh, I got a publication in X journal, and I'm saying, well, your mother must be proud. That's really quite nice. Why are you doing what you're doing? Is it to get a line on your resume, or is it actually to substantively say something scientific or or scholarly that you want other people to pay attention to. And people will sort of say, well, it's important that I get a line on a resume. Well, yeah, sure. Okay. But, if all you're really kind of doing is attempting to get lines on the resume, then you kind of have certain types of real issues here. And this kind of comes back to, it's a bit of a joke here, right? But if you think about what we do as academics, okay, it's kind of interesting when you sort of look at this thing here, right? Okay. And it says, okay, the sum of people who are interested in your research divided by the world population. It's a tiny number. Okay. I can tell you right now, my family has no clue what I do. Okay. I've been in this business for 30 plus years. They have no idea what I do. None whatsoever. They don't care. And if my family doesn't care, imagine what the rest of the world thinks. Okay. It's not, the key then becomes not whether I'm doing something which will materially matter to a kind of a large population in the world, but that whether what I'm doing actually materially matters to the people that I think are part of the audience that I really want to sort of kind of aim for. And this kind of also hints at a problem that many people run into, right? And this is kind of the Dilbert aspect of this, and every time I come up with a new idea, I discover 10 people have already done it. Okay. And there's this aspect of this kind of, well, how do I generate originality in a world in which there are all sorts of other smart people doing all sorts of other things? And I remember when I was an undergraduate, I had this, what I thought at that time was a great idea. And I went into one of the professor's offices at Carnegie Mellon and said, oh, I've really got this great idea. Do you think anybody has ever, and it's about as far as I got. And the guy said, yes. Okay. And I just stopped and looked at him, and he just said, look, don't think that you're so smart that you have that there aren't smarter people out there, or people as smart as you who haven't thought about exactly what it is that you're going to tell me. Okay. That's not really the way things work. And this is kind of the interesting aspect of these sort of kind of aha ideas, where you discover something that is just absolutely completely new to the world. Absolutely nobody has ever really thought about it. Those are truly rare. That the vast majority of things that you see in the journals are incrementalism. They are not big discoveries, despite what the university or the journal's Twitter feed might tell you. They are very marginal, and what that means is that when you're pulling together kind of a publication strategy and you're thinking about what it is that you're doing, constantly trying to swing for the fences in American parlance, constantly trying to hit home runs, it isn't necessarily kind of going to be the winning strategy in that world. Okay. And so what you have to really do is you have to really think about the nature of kind of, well, all right, who am I communicating with? What is it that this particular study is doing? How is it adding value? And put this together in terms of a package. And this is where the definition of kind of, well, what is a contribution come in? And you'll see many people who write about these types of things will come up with all of these kind of long laundry lists about, what kind of contribution are you really making? But the main point is the main contribution that you're making is to be kind of part of common cause, to contribute to knowledge and understanding. In other words, that no one paper makes a person's career. Okay? Not even any one book really makes a person's career. What ends up happening is that people start believing in your competence. They start believing in your ideas. They start believing in your ability to contribute to a larger conversation. And then they start paying a lot more attention to you. And this is something I think that when people think about things, if they think on it on a paper by paper basis, then they lose track of what it is that they're ultimately contributing to a larger conversation. So you tend to have to think about kind of larger research projects, different ways of communicating around what it is that you're doing, a portfolio of different types of publications. I write certain papers for certain sorts of kind of audiences. I write certain papers for certain types of means of sort of kind of providing evidence on a problem. Maybe I write a book to pull that together. It becomes a 10-year project. It isn't just a sequence of, one paper, next paper, next paper, next paper, next paper. It actually becomes part of a larger strategy where you're thinking about the portfolio of the things that you're doing, many of which may not be published at all. I have more things unpublished than I have things published. And part of the reason is that when I finally kind of got to the point where I thought, okay, well, is there really something here? I didn't think it was worth the time and the energy to kind of try to beat it into and force it into a journal when maybe it wasn't really kind of a radical contribution. But in writing a book about it, I actually can insert a lot of this other bits and pieces of information. So you become part of kind of a contributory pool of people. And people start seeking you out because of the nature of sort of kind of what it is that you do. Okay. But there are different types of sources of contributions. And generally this is the food chain of those contributions. I don't completely agree with the food chain as it stands. But this is kind of what distinguishes kind of certain types of journals from other types of journals. And the first of these is kind of finding theoretical gaps. In the sense that most of the kind of major journals always ask questions about, okay, well, what's your contribution to theory here? I don't think necessarily this is the wisest thing to do, but that's a philosophical argument for another day. The second part is the empirical gap. In other words, you have gaps in predictions, you have gaps in findings, you fill in things that are associated with what it is that you're seeing empirically. You have methodological gaps, and that is how problems are studied. One of the real problems that bedevils many fields is the endogeneity, not the endogeneity, but the fact that you never really do test theories. Well, it turns out in our field we don't test theories very much at all. But the main problem that many people have is that they don't recognize that when they, let's say, test something, they attempt to kind of validate their theory, they're not really doing that because they have a dual test, which is the test of methodology and theory at the same time. And what this means is it means that your empirical results are effectively nested within the empirical methodology that you use. And even if that's qualitative methodology, it doesn't really matter. The main point being that a lot of big gaps, empirical gaps, arise because what people show is that the empirical models are actually driving the results, rather than the empirical models really being effective test of results. So there's a lot of work that people do around looking at methodological gaps, and in fact, even in some of my own work, some of the biggest findings were to show that almost the entire fields were driven not by truth but by methodological bias. And then there's a contextual gap, which matters quite a bit with respect to application work. And this is the next one here, which is substantive gap in terms of applications. And that is that what you've got a problem and you want to see how that problem applies to a different context or a different application area. And this is generally considered to be lowest in the food chain. But the main point of this being that for business audiences, for policy audiences, these contextual and substantive gaps are actually very big. Okay, in other words, the government wants to know, does a health policy that's operating in Australia work in the UK? And from a theoretical standpoint, there's nothing unique about that. From a methodological standpoint, there's nothing unique about that. What they want to know is they want to know, okay, would what we've seen empirically in the Australian context, would it work in the UK? And businesses do exactly the same thing. In other words, can this, something that we know about in the tourism industry be extrapolated over into another industry? Is something associated with supply chains? Can we extract that to IT, or from IT to supply chains? But generally speaking, there's kind of a food chain associated with what it is that we see. And this food chain then gets kind of expanded onto the nature of the rigor and relevance. And I don't view rigor and relevance the way a lot of people confuse rigor and relevance with academia versus practice. Okay, that's really not relevant. Okay, what rigor is rigor is associated. I'll talk about two different types of it, but it's associated conceptually with, is the thing grounded logically in the base disciplines or base discipline? Okay, does it use frameworks that and theories that are well understood and or clear? Okay, in other words, is it use the right concepts? Are those concepts clear? You get rid of all kind of the fuzzy. The more rigorous your study, the better it is at being able to be clear about what theories are being tested, what concepts, what constructs are being used, and on down the line. And what this does is it ensures that the why is clear. You start to work through that why. And then you have methodological rigor. Okay. And so this part here is kind of conceptual or theoretical. This one methodological, and that is, are you using the right type of data? Are you using appropriate methods? Is what you've got verifiable? Okay. And this ensures that the how is clear. Okay. In other words, somebody looking at your conceptual model can look at it and say, yeah, I understand that. I see what the person is doing. If they're defining constructs, it's very clear how they're defining constructs, and they're well understood within the literature. Methodologically, it's exactly the same thing. Have you done what you said you're going to do in the right way, in an appropriate way, with avoiding any errors? But then you come to relevance, and relevance is the language. The relevance is relevant to whom? Okay. In other words, if rigor is associated with the why and the how, okay, relevance is associated with the to whom and the what. All right. And this is where I think this notion of kind of rigor and relevance associated with academia versus practice is a total waste of time. Okay, because what it means is, it means rigor is associated with appropriateness, and relevance is associated with that targeting. Okay. And then you can sort of say, okay, well, how do I discover stuff? What is it that's kind of in all of this? And there are different ways of thinking about this. I won't go through them in huge detail. You can find stuff. Okay, you have conflicting findings. Okay, there might be an area where there are lack of findings, and you're sort of kind of seeing things for the first time. It could be theoretical based findings. It could be illogical theoretical reasoning. One of the first papers I wrote in the international business field basically looked at one of the kind of foundational frameworks in the field. And it said, if you believe everything they say, you do not get the results that they say you get. In other words, because they never did any form modeling, it turns out that it was kind of a wing and a prayer that what they were talking about, assuming and the way they structured things would lead to certain types of outcomes. And we showed, no, that's not the case at all. That theoretically the thing was fundamentally flawed. And we did this logically, just by showing that there were logically inconsistencies between the underlying assumptions and the implications. There could be inconsistent theoretical explanations with relates to empirical results. In fact, if you look in the international business field, again, an area where we've done a lot of work, you actually see that only about 60% of the hypotheses that are proposed are verified or consistent with the data, which means that you have a 6 out of 10 chance of getting something what appears to be right. For me, that actually means that probably almost all the theories are probably wrong. because 6 out of 10 is not really what you would bet on very much. So in that sense, you sort of say, well, look, the data in 40% of the cases is telling you that what you're proposing is wrong, is not working. Why? You can have model-based discovery, which is related to how you structure things, taking apart black boxes and models. And you can have application-based discovery, and that is that you can look at the normative results that people propose based upon theory and data, and show that there are inconsistencies here, or there's a different way or a better way of thinking about a problem. So you can make all these different contributions, but again, the real question is the to whom? Who are you aiming this at? And different audiences will respond to what they would consider to be a unique discovery in one way, while other individuals may look on it as being nothing particularly new in terms of what it is that they would be seeing. So in some sense, you want to kind of work your way through this and say, well, look, how do I find something that's new here? Well, one, you have to kind of work on something which is important. I made a point in another talk that, you can't kind of spend your time chipping away at tiny inconsequential things. If at the end of the day, that's all your work ends up being, then you really have a problem saying you made a contribution. Okay. And there are ways to think about doing this. Okay. And, I've done probably all three, but you can think about, new ways of thinking about problems. And these are not kind of radical ideas. They're just simply kind of ways of reformulating and relensing a problem. So you could, for example, look at interfaces between disciplines. You could look at kind of applications of ideas or structures from one area of work and ask the question, okay, well, do they affect my thinking on things? And Einstein was classic between mathematics and physics, right? Pauling between physics, chemistry, and biology, right? Now, some people might call this interdisciplinarity, but I don't really view it that way. Effectively, what you're doing is you're asking the question, if I start twisting this problem around, using different tools and thinking about it in different ways, do it come up with different types of conclusions associated with this? I don't get necessarily good triangulation by doing this. You could apply new tools. You could come at things in different ways. If you look at accounting and finance today, particularly if you're doing it in financial markets, is minute by minute, second by second, nanosecond by nanosecond transaction level data. But back in the 1960s, they didn't have that data. Okay, it was the genius of the Center for Research and Security Prices at the University of Chicago, and then later the work that was done at Wharton, which is now the Wharton Data Analytics Center, that started to look at data and say, well, we need better data. And as soon as they started to get better data, they started to see different things that they never saw before. Okay, so it's kind of like looking at an animal and then looking at the innards of an animal through a telescope or through a microscope. Okay, it's like looking up at the sky and seeing stars and then having a telescope. All of a sudden, they started to see things that said, well, hang on a second here, there's more going on. And then as they dug deeper, got better data, they applied new tools, they had to develop new methodologies. All of this led to kind of a cascading associated with the way things are looked at. And even today, when we talk about big data analytics is nothing new. Okay, imagine if you were a physicist back in the 1970s and you've got a telescope and that telescope is looking out and it sees billions of stars. How does it analyze that data? And the answer is it analyzes that data using algorithms, which are today big data. Okay, so you have really different ways of thinking about problems that are kind of new things. Looking at the same old problems using the same old methods most likely will get you the same old results. And then looking at things at different levels of analysis. And this is, again, it might sound trite, but some big discoveries were related to this. Ronald Coase, won Nobel Prize. Ronald Coase, in theory of the firm, started to ask questions that people never really were asking, maybe with the exception of Adam Smith. But again, Coase was going a bit deeper from this. John Dunning in international business asked a very simple question, and that was that we've got all this trade economics out there, but most trade actually occurs through multinationals. Can you talk about global trade without talking about multinationals? And the whole IB field grew out of that very simple way of thinking about things. I can't remember when the article was first published, but he basically asked this question, I think around 1957 or something. And he said, look, can you talk about trade without talking about the vector of trade? The vector of trade are these multinational corporations. Why don't we, is there something unique about what it is that they're doing, right? All of these are kind of ingenious ways of thinking about things, okay? But it's not about, being better, okay? You may run into this problem where you think about uniqueness because you don't know something. So people will sort of say, oh, I'm interested, I'm looking at this in China. And people will say, okay, well, okay, fine, that's okay. But explain to me why that's unique. Explain to me what's so different about that I would kind of want to come back and look at it this way. And then uniqueness also only matters when it provides a unique lens on constructs. Okay, just because somebody hasn't done something doesn't mean that that something is worth doing. And a lot of students, particularly PhD students and others, tend to fall into the context trap, and they tend to fall into the uniqueness trap. And that is that they don't understand that they have to kind of go beyond what might be seen to them as something which is not new. And business people do this all the time. Okay, I'm on a board of a group which is running a big global project, and it has a corporate board. Okay, so there's this kind of, the good and the great of the corporate world are part of this thing. Okay, and there are a couple of ratbag academics like me. And one of the things that's really interesting is that they'll come up with all these ideas, and they'll sort of say, well, really somebody should go and study this. Okay, and the academics will stand back and say, actually, there are 1,000 studies on that. Okay, that thing's been studied for 25 years. There's no reason to go back and study it again. But the problem, of course, is the business people don't know this. And students, particularly PhD students and DBA students, have this tendency at times to overemphasize what they might perceive to be a uniqueness associated with the problem, but not realize that if they dig deeper into this, if they actually look into it in some detail, there isn't a lot of solid reason why, for example, the China context or the Indian context should be all that different from, let's say, the United States. Because what they see is they say, oh, China in 1990, look at the development of China. India 2000, look at the development of India. And they look at the United States in 1990 and 2000 and say, well, that's different. And they say, yeah, okay, of course that's different. What about the United States in 1840 or 1880? Okay. And then all of a sudden you sort of say, oh, well, hang on a second here. Maybe it's not all that different. Okay. So you can overemphasize kind of thinking that you're because you're going into a field that hasn't been plowed, that somehow it's going to be a fertile field for work. Okay. And then it also, you have to kind of also think about understanding the base cases of what it is you're doing. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later on. So I'm going to leave this one for now. Okay, so the main point of this, though, is that one of the things that you really need to think about, and this is where I'm going to stop, and then we'll kind of go on to some more journal things after some questions, okay, is that, there's a Goldilocks aspect of the nature of doing good scholarship. And that is that it's not too big and it's not too small. If it's too small, then it becomes irrelevant very quickly, okay? If it's new to you, but not new to the world, then it isn't really going to excite very many people. And then you get the other side of things, and that is, where people think that they're going to solve global warming, they're going to solve climate change problem. Okay, they're going to solve these huge, gnarly, difficult problems. Okay, with one study, or a small number of studies, when thousands of people have been hacking away at that problem for quite some time. And the reality is that it's somewhere in between. And that somewhere in between is to be able to kind of break problems down into components, into a structured way. Next set of the slides, because I know that there's a kind of aspects of this. This is kind of aimed a little bit more to the academic side, but it does apply kind of to everything. So if you think about which journal or which outlet, so if you're thinking about the Academy Management Journal, Journal of Finance, or you're thinking about something like foreign policy or foreign affairs, which one, right? Where do you send your work? And the answer is it goes back to the to whom. All right, to whom are you speaking? And you can ask the question, do they publish here? And or do they read what's published here? All right. So if you want to influence a business audience, there's a food chain of things that you write. For increasingly, it might not even be journals if you're looking for influence. I was one of kind of an early person on Clubhouse, and that's kind of a bit of a rabbit hole if there ever was one. But being on something like Clubhouse actually matters to very specific types of individuals who might want to communicate to other types of individuals of that type. The main point of this being you have to know that to whom, and then that to whom directs you to the outlets that you want. And then you want to look at things like impact factors. Now, for policy types of things, it isn't the impact factors, but it really is kind of the readership. Are you going to write for the Spectator? Are you going to write for the Guardian? Are you going to write for the Times or the Financial Times or whatever? Right? And the key in some sense here is kind of why you're writing. Are you writing to be read, or are you writing to write? For many academics, for many people in the academic realm, they actually write to write. They don't write to be read. So in spite of everything that people like me might tell them, they assume that what they're doing is interesting to people. They have no justification for that assumption, but they assume. Okay, and then you can ask about the natural peer set. Okay, in other words, do the to whom fit into your natural peer set? Are these people for whom you kind of want to build a network and utilize that structure in some way, shape, or form to build your profile? Because ultimately what you're doing is you're an intellectual entrepreneur. What you're doing is you're selling your ideas. Okay, and it doesn't matter who you're selling your ideas to, but you need a network structure of interested parties, who will kind of draw you in. In other words, they'll see things that you would have written, and and they'll recognize, oh, well, that might be something I want to read. But you also have to understand how the process works. So this is kind of much more journal driven. In other words, who makes the decision? The editor, in journal case, associate editor. How influential are the reviewers? Some journals are very much driven by the editors. So if you take even a journal like Sloan Management Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, Technology, MIT Technology Review, Harvard Business Review, very editor driven. The decisions are made with the editors, and sometimes those editors are not academics. Some also put heavy emphasis on the reviewers. So you can have the same journal and different editors over time, and the journal will swing dramatically. The personality of the editor matters a lot. So I know, for example, the Journal of Marketing Research has had different editors over. I think they're there every 3 years or every 5 years, and a number of those have been close friends of mine. And the impact of the reviewers changes dramatically from person to person. Some editors are very deferential to reviewers. Some editors are not. When I was an editor, I was not very deferential to reviewers. Reviewers were to me advisors. They weren't decision makers. I was a decision maker. Um, and the, if you looked at the people who followed me in one of the journals, they were much more swayed by reviewers. I myself and my co-editor at the time, we simply made our own decisions. So the personalities matter a lot, and this is why it's important, particularly for students, if they're, when they're submitting things to journals, to talk to their advisors or other people who know the editors or know the journal, because they can literally say, here's how it's going to work, because they'll know that person, or they'll know how to read the letter that the editor writes. So there isn't nepotism in journals. I've rarely seen it, to be honest. It's what it is it's private knowledge. In other words, if I get a letter from one editor, okay, I can interpret that. And I remember once I had a former graduate student. We submitted a paper to a journal, and it came back, and he came in, he was almost in tears, and he was sort of saying, "Oh, this is awful," and I looked at it, and I just bust out laughing and said, "No, this is actually okay. This is fine. This will work out. No problem." Okay. And the reason was he couldn't understand kind of the way in which the editor was writing the letter, and then interpreting what the reviewers were doing. And it turned out it was fine. It was okay. It's just that, editors and reviewers, at times will make what appear to be harsh statements. But the harshest statement they can make is, "We're rejecting your paper and we don't want to see it again." If they don't say if they don't say that, anything else is okay. You might be able to work with anything else. And then different people will write these things in different ways. You have to think about the style of the journal, the way you write for that type of audience. These change dramatically from journal to journal, the way things are referenced, the use of footnotes, all of this stuff. I once had a paper in law journal. Law journals are completely different in the way in which they operate, the way in which they cite things, how they structure what it is that they do. Luckily I had a lawyer as a co-author, so it was okay. But the main point was, if she wasn't there, it would have been really tough. Even with myself and my co-author, who were very knowledgeable academics in business, we would have been hopeless in that world without her. And then the style of the reviews, the people, academics in particular, right? There's no shortage of ego in academia. Okay. And so people like to read things which they think they would have written. Okay. If a reviewer thinks they could have done a much better job than you, your paper will probably be rejected. But if they look at it and say, "Yeah, I could have written this," or it looks like something, similar to what I do, then it becomes easier. This comes back to this kind of, how do you convince people that you've got a good argument? Well, people like to read things which have styles which are very similar to what they do, which is why I tell many students, if you're going to publish a paper in a certain journal, you really have to read the way people who publish in that journal write, how they structure their sections of their paper, how do they structure their data, how do they structure what it is that they do. Now, some of these are very formulaic. For example, in the psych journals, such as Psych Bulletin or Journal of Applied Psych, they're very formulaic, very formulaic. I have friends who publish, kind of reasonable number in those types of journals, and they literally have word templates, and then they fill in the template, as they do their work. So some journals are very formulaic that way. Other ones, there's kind of a style, but the style isn't necessarily the most observable. So I sometimes tell students, read this paper, look at these papers here, because this is the style that journal really seems to like a lot. And so you really want to think about that. And the reviewers, these are papers which are successful, which means that they fit with what the reviewers and the editors are looking for. And the review process is brutal. It's absolutely totally brutal. People in business never really understand this, but I actually, told them, I said, suppose, that we actually ran a promotion system or a project review system in companies the way we run it in journals. They're horrified, where they would kind of learn how it is, that in other words, their name is stripped off the thing. There's nothing which is identifiable as to who it is that they are. The people who are commenting on it are completely anonymous to them. It takes 3 months, 6 months to get any commentary back, and then it takes 3, 4, 5 years beyond that, and 30 or 40 rewrites of the paper before maybe it gets accepted, and in 95% of the cases, it gets rejected. Most people will be crushed under that model of reality. So it is a brutal process. And 95% of the time, you never get this point. You basically are like, the Black Knight in Monty Python. You've got every limb hacked off, and you're sort of kind of struggling along. But there are certain ways to think about trying to make this better. It doesn't make it perfect, but it helps. So you have to think about what you do before you submit papers. Okay. You have to use outlets to test fly ideas. I make an argument that what you have to do is present parts of the paper and not the whole paper that you're working on. Once you put things into a paper, people do not understand sunk cost. And so what happens is they anchor on what it is that they've done. Okay. Because sometimes I've told people this when, kind of come with a paper, 40 pages, 60 pages, they come in and they sort of say, well, this is what I'm going to submit. And I say, no, you got to start over again, throw everything away and do it from the beginning again, and they look at me in horror when you do this. And the reason is that they shouldn't have done it that way. What they should have done is they should have started to test fly parts of the paper, so that what they could then do is kind of figure out what bits and pieces they should keep and what pieces they shouldn't keep. So you want to present things. You want to be very public about this. This idea that what you do is you sit in your room and you work and you work and you work, and then something pops out at the end of the day, it's prescription for bad outcome. Do things like presenting stuff at conferences, but don't believe conference reviews. The correlation between getting a paper, even getting a best paper award at a conference, and the publishing of that paper is virtually nil. Okay. There's almost no link between those. Conferences are not journals. Okay. Conferences are meant to be attended by very large numbers of people. Journal publications are meant to be the outlet of a very small number of people. Okay. So you go to something like the Academy of Management Conference, or the ASSA with economics and that, there were thousands of papers. Okay. Most of those papers aren't going to see the light of day. And in many cases, the authors don't care. In other words, they're there, believe it or not, to actually start flying different ideas out, and they have kind of crazy things in their mind, and they want to do that. But if they believe that what they've got is they've got a paper, and the paper, kind of got good reviews from the conference, that when they send it to the journal, they get horrified when the 3 reviewers come back and say no. And the editor says no. And I've literally gotten letters from saying, oh, my paper was shortlisted for the best paper in this conference. How dare you reject my paper? And the answer is chalk and cheese. It's completely different. In the Academy of Management, 60% of the reviewers, probably 70% now, for the conference are graduate students. Okay, professors don't review for the conferences, rarely, and if they do, it's a perfunctory review. Their time's too valuable. They spend their time on the journals. Okay, and then get your colleagues to write reviews of what it is that you're doing, not just kind of give you ideas, but write reviews. In my prior institutions, we used to run workshops every week where people would do all of these things, all these things. I was once invited to give a talk at Berkeley by Oliver Williamson, and I gave this talk, and afterwards, several of the graduate students came up to me and handed me reviews of my paper. And as part of the process, Ollie used to make students write reviews of the presenters at seminars. So there are all sorts of ways to do this, right? You do mock reviews, okay, and then even have naive review individuals, review what you're doing. I use librarians a lot. I have a lot of friends who are librarians. Ask them to read things, and just say, look, I know you don't understand kind of this, all the crap behind this, but can you give me a view of these things? Can you understand at least the logic of where I'm going with this? So it's there. And then, if you're lucky, you get a revise and resubmit. Revise and resubmit is basically a foot in the door. The door can be slammed shut. But my argument is, if you can get your foot in the door, you can get your knee in the door. If you can get your knee in the door, you can get your leg in the door. If you can get your leg in the door, you can get your arm in the door. And pretty soon you can pry the door open and get your head and the rest of your body through the door. So you really got to take it seriously in terms of sort of kind of what it is that you're doing. Because if you get this R&R and you really work, even if the paper gets rejected, the paper will be better. There was a study, again, I think in Science or Nature, where they looked at papers which had been rejected, and then they compared those to papers which were accepted at the first journal they went to. And what they found is that the papers that had been rejected and were subsequently published were actually more impactful than the papers which were accepted in the first go, which meant that there's kind of some value added to the processing. And then what happens if you get a reject? Well, get used to it, suck it up. I mean, this is what happens. In 95% of the cases, journals reject papers. Good journals reject papers. Certainly 90%. People have this belief, that academics who are kind of better at publishing are somehow, they don't get rejected, and that's just nuts. It doesn't occur, and it's funny. I was at a conference a number of years ago in Beijing, and we were doing a doctoral consortium, and I asked the students, the PhD students who were at the conference, what they thought the rejection rate was of the faculty who were running the consortium, okay, which was me and this guy Mike Hitt and a few other people like that. When they came back with these numbers, which were ridiculous, which were 10%, 20%, 30%. And then we, went to faculty and said, okay, well, what's your rejection rate? And the answer was the rejection rate was a little bit better than the baseline rejection rate, but not very much better. And the difference is that the question was, well, then why do you get so many publications? And the answer is you're very good at taking papers which have been rejected and knowing what to do with them to make them, kind of have a second life. So rejection is part of academic life. You just have to kind of know what to do with it. Some of my best papers have been rejected. And in fact, there's a nice book which goes through all these Nobel Prize winners in economics and shows the reviews and other things of the papers that they had rejected, which subsequently recited in their Nobel award. But reviewers aren't an axis of evil. If they don't like the paper, something's wrong. There's something there that they just don't get. You might get the who wrong, which means the paper's targeted in the wrong way. You might get the how wrong, which means you're using incorrect language and methods. You might get the why wrong. In other words, it's not as interesting as you think it is, certainly to them. And you might even have the wrong problem. And I had a paper which ultimately did get published, but took many years. And what happened was we structured paper methodologically was really good. We never changed the methodology, but the problem was that we started and we situated the paper in a certain literature, and we said this paper is about X. It's not about Y. It's about X. Even though we're talking about this area of this application area, but it's not about that application area. It's about this other thing over here. Even though we said this at the beginning of the paper, we said this to the editor sent it to reviewers who were in that area, not in the area we wanted, but in the other area. And they came back and they just trashed us. I mean, they just royally trashed us. All three of them told us to go look for another job. And what we did is we looked at this and said, okay, well, what do we do with this? And our view was, we'll never solve this problem. This problem will arise, no matter where we send the paper. So, but we're not experts in this kind of narrow area. And what we did is we went and we got, somebody in that area, and they helped us reframe the paper and go through, and in the end, we ended up publishing it in a better journal from a citation standpoint than we had submitted to the first time. But the point of being was when we got rejected, we looked at it and said, we know why this thing got rejected. We understand this. We shared our reviews with other people. It's there. But the key is not to just fling the paper into your B option, and there's a reason for this. One is that the reviewers are telling you something, and the likelihood that another set of reviewers would tell you something similar could be quite high. The second thing, though, is that if you send the paper to another journal, it may be that the same people get the paper again. Okay. And I've had situations where on both sides, okay, where as an editor, I've got a paper, I send it out to review. Within 5 minutes of sending that paper out for review, I get an email back saying this paper had been submitted to this other journal. I was a reviewer. The paper was rejected yesterday or last week. And what we do in those circumstances as editors is we go back and we withdraw the paper. And we tell the authors, this is what we found out about the paper. You haven't made any changes based upon the prior reviews. We're desk rejecting the paper. And they don't like that, and they call you names and they do other things like that. But lesson learned, I guess. The other is, that it just shows disdain for the reviewers. In other words, all the people are doing is they're throwing darts at the board, and they think their ideas are great and the criticisms aren't really very valuable. And frankly, nobody really wants to deal with people like that. And so what we always recommend, and this is what I always do too, is to go through what I call an after rejection review. And that is, you don't overreact. You just say, okay, fine. This is, there are reasons why you're rejected. And sometimes you have to give it a week or 2 weeks, is kind of cool down a little bit. You have to share the rejection. You really, it's not useful for you only to read the reviews. So I tend, and colleagues of mine, we tend to share all this stuff and just say, okay, what do you think, really should be done here? And I've even told people, and I've been told by others, just kill the project. There's no way, you're going to revive this thing. Just bury it. But in most cases, you get some good responses to this. And then you prepare a response. In other words, even though the paper was rejected, we always prepare a response as if the paper wasn't rejected and we're responding to reviewers. So we go back and ask the question, okay, well, how have we changed? How have we addressed that problem? How have we done all things, right? And go through the process again, and then go back to the WISC journal, right? So you flip it all the way around. So there's kind of a process here associated with what it is that you're doing. In terms of sort of kind of trying to learn from things. And as you become older, you simply become less emotional, you become more balanced about how things work. Okay. And you get a different perspective on things. But the main point of this is publishing is part of a larger scientific conversation. It's not an end in itself. No one paper matters. You really just have to kind of have a good idea of the portfolio of things that you're doing. you must have something to say to people who are willing to listen, and who ultimately, if you do have something to say and they're willing to listen to it, then they seek you out